Fantastic. Okay. Yeah, so let's get diving into this. I'm Douglas. Ivan, and what we do, we're basically a managed open source data company. So, open source technologies like Kafka, Postgres, etc. We can manage those for you on any cloud. And what brings me particularly to this conversation is Kafka Connect, and we have an Iceberg sync. And one of the big things is us being open source. And so this original talk actually comes from a software engineer at Ivan who has worked here for over 5 years. He basically is part of the initial creating Kafka at Ivan and worked on the Kafka Connect and Iceberg syncs and getting those on multi-cloud for AWS, Azure, etc. So unfortunately, his visa failed him. He's based out of Finland. He's Russian, and it just wasn't able to work out. And so he sent me instead. I'm a solution architect here, and I basically, for the past 5 years, have worked in the Kafka ecosystem and helping out clients to modernize their data infrastructure. So I guess I kind of asked this before we started, but I am curious, who actually here debugs Kafka Connect itself? Or Iceberg syncs, or anything kind of Iceberg related, just raise a hand. Cool. Okay. Just because I'm asking this because we only have 15 minutes, I am going to try to get a little technical, but I am also going to stay kind of high overview because this is only 10 minutes. But the engineer who wasn't able to be here has a repo. I'll share it here at the end. We can get contacts and stuff, and I can also email it to you. But that's the place where you can actually dive deeper into debugging this stuff and just testing out a sandbox environment. So with that said, I'm going to bring up kind of a high overview of basically the Iceberg sync and all of the different components necessary for it. To understand why debugging this can get a little bit nuanced, right? So let's look at what's actually happening under the hood here. So we have the Apache Kafka and the data topics control topic on the left. Basically in step 1, multiple data worker tasks consume from those topics. And then you can see, if you can, in that step 2, that they're actually going to be writing Parquet files to the object storage, S3, GC, GCS, etc. And this is all pretty standard. 1 and 2 is pretty standard for any, I guess, kind of generic connector. But where things get a little interesting is where those workers don't actually commit anything to the catalog. Instead, in step 3, you can see them emitting file metadata. And so saying, I wrote file X to a control topic back in Kafka, and that's the dashed line that you see looping back. And so then we're going to be in that metadata commit phase where a specialized committer task is going to be reading that metadata and sending it to the control topic, getting that from the control topic, and then ultimately writing those Iceberg manifests, and finally executing the kind of ACID compliant commands based off that. So this is a multi-phase approach, but hopefully this architecture guides the rest of our conversation around understanding why each of these components are important when debugging your kind of Iceberg sync, and why what we're about to get into, which is embedded Kafka Connect, is a great option for doing that locally. So that gets us into kind of one of the deeper reasons. So actually, right before we get to the embedded Kafka Connect, we're first going to go into an issue that one of our engineers was running into. So quick question, again, is do you guys know if you are using a shared Kafka Connect cluster at all at your organization, or if you're using just a standalone that you're actually deploying? Do you guys have a shared one on dev or production? Or do you not know? Does anyone know shared? Okay, should we have shared? Any other shared, no shared? If not, it's fine. This example is going to be going into some of the nuances if you do have a shared cluster and some of the things there. So for the story's sake, imagine you're a data engineer, right? You're getting Kafka into Iceberg, and locally everything's working. You've done your research, you've used your code and you've gotten it there. Now it's time for dev and stage, and you have a shared cluster. You don't manage your own. And so maybe a central platform team takes care of this for you. Now you've packaged up your config, you've sent it over to them, and it immediately errors. And so the example that we're using here is one that our engineering team ran into, which is an AWS secret provider is not allowed. But you question to yourself, because in this instance, you weren't even using AWS secrets providers. And so the platform team says, hey, like, we use it for another connector, but the class loader isolation shouldn't be running into any problems. And so you kind of look into your side, you say, okay, well, maybe it's tests I need to run, but you're running into in-test, it's working fine locally. Then you're trying to set up some sort of, dev environment, production environment via Docker. But this takes time, because if you don't set it up perfectly the first time, it takes 5 to 7 minutes to spin back up this remote debugging session, and it can lead to a lot of developer velocity kill. And so that's why we ran into using embedded Connect clusters instead. Or not completely instead, but because for external dependencies, you can still use like test containers and stuff. But what embedded Connect cluster is it's part of the Apache Kafka project itself. It's in the Connect runtime module. And so it's the same thing that like Kafka developers use to actually test the Connect. And what it gives you is this Kafka broker and Connect worker running inside the same JVM tests. So think about what exactly that means is that you don't have to SSH in a thing, no remote debugging ports. You're running it all from your IDE via debug mode. You're able to then set breakpoints where you can run assertions, etc., on what is exactly happening in all of those different, class loader, config resolution, etc. See exactly what's happening under the hood. And again, developer velocity coming out of this is better, simplicity, etc., and using the open source stuff itself locally. So with that said, that's kind of that's the big thing. And so I do now want to get into one of the kind of quirks of working with, the Iceberg sync that using this helped a lot with. And this will also be in the ending kind of repo at the very end if you want to play around with it, set the debug points yourself. And so let's dive into that. It's kind of this worker property across the connector boundary idea of a quirk. And so under the hood, config providers are usually set at the worker level. So this would then resolve secrets before a connector even starts. But the Iceberg connector is a little interesting. It actually tries to be helpful with this load worker props function to load all of the host worker keys at the beginning for you. And when the connector then starts and has its internal clients for the client topic, it passes the entire map of worker properties, including those secrets, directly to the admin client. So there is a known CVE, security vulnerability for this, but and basically when it went out is it's to prevent that malicious code execution from this, and Kafka now requires a property to disallow automatic config providers, basically to get around this vulnerability for internal clients. And so you're kind of hitting this catch-22, right? You have, if you allow automatic providers, you're exposed to this kind of security vulnerability. And then if you disallow them, the connector actually will crash, blindly trying to instantiate a host provider. So with that said, that's kind of the quirk that's going on. And again, like you can, kind of going back to those test containers and everything, a lot of people who just go straight to dev, it might work locally, it's not gonna work there. But that's where we can get into this kind of breakpoint chain of seeing all of this step by step if you're using this embedded Kafka Connect, and you're able to set the breakpoints, and this is what's in the repo of where we're setting them. So the first one's gonna be this kind of leak where you can go in and you can see, hey, this load worker props returns a map containing the host file config provider and their SSL key store password, and you can see that. And then you can see the handoff where it's pumping that into the admin props. And then lastly, you have this security check where the abstract config Java is going to be, basically it creates the allow checklist, looks through it, sees none, and then it's going to hit some config exception of some sort because the ability to load a provider isn't working. And so internally, based off of this, we dropped the load worker props to ensure that the connector is only looking for things with, like, for our Iceberg sync, for instance, it was like iceberg.kafka.star, which is kind of restoring that boundary again between the worker and the connector. But again, this will be in the repo, and you can walk through it. You can add more breakpoints, and then this will also give you a taste and feel of like actually using the embedded Kafka Connect cluster itself. Yes, and so I did want to quickly talk about a couple major takeaways that hopefully you can take into using the repo. So the first one is that even in something like Kafka Connect, for instance, you can still have those kind of configurations leak across boundaries. So it's always important to limit those internal clients to the minimum necessary config. And then the big one is kind of like shifting left on debugging, right? So don't wait for that shared cluster, especially if you're in a shared cluster environment. And if you don't know if you're in a shared cluster environment, like probably you'll learn that whenever you send a dev, and if it doesn't work, right? But using that embedded Kafka Connect inside of your CI/CD pipeline to catch that class loader and config issues early. And then, lastly, whenever you're using this all locally, what's really nice about that is you're able to set those breakpoints. You're able to set assertions based off of this. And this is all part of, again, the Apache Kafka project itself. And so it's something that they're using as well. And so definitely recommend it. This is what our engineering team has ran into. And that's it. Trying to wrap up a little early. So if there's any questions, I can answer them or connect. But here is the repository. That's all.